This is a carburetor. Best described as a very clever way to poorly meter fuel and air into an internal combustion engine. And it's extremely clever. I mean, it holds fuel in a float bowl. It has a venturi in there and uses engineering principles of fluid dynamics from people like Bernoulli to draw that fuel up into an airstream and deliver the right ratio of atomised fuel into your cylinder. And it's got to be able to cope with so much. It's got to be able to cope with changes in elevation, changes in air density, and changes in temperature. It's got to cope with changes in engine demand, and it's got to cope with centrifugal force. It's got to do all of that, and it manages to achieve it. So what I want to know is, why does everybody lose their mind the second you want to fit one of these? And then you want to compound the issue by fitting one of these. Welcome to Basket Case. Okay, so in order to understand what changes we make in a carburetor, we first must understand how the thing works. Now, if you have a look, I've got a carburetor here, or a carburetor body here, with the slide removed. If I open up the butterflies, I'm pretty sure you should be able to see, well, I'll just throw a bit of extra light in there, that the centre of the carburetor is actually elliptical. So it's squashed in on the sides. And what that is it's a venturi. So what we have is a chamber that flows air into the engine. This is the air cleaner side, incoming air is here. And this is your engine side. In the middle, it's squashed in. Obviously, not in this orientation, but that's it there. So what that achieves is a thing called a venturi. Now, there was a gentleman who was an Italian physicist called Daniel Bernoulli, and he did a lot of studies on fluid dynamics, and particularly flows and pressures, and the impact of potential energy, kinetic energy, etc., etc. And we know that from those studies that when you have a velocity and a flow and a pressure and a density, and you put it through a venturi, you have an increase in velocity through here. So it speeds up. But as a result, the pressure in that venturi is lower than the relative to the incoming air. So essentially we've got atmospheric pressure here, and we have a reduced pressure here. And it's got a high enough Reynolds number that it's actually turbulent flow. We control the flow of the air primarily from a butterfly, which is operated by our throttle cable. So as the air flows through here, we have a chamber underneath the venturi known as a bowl, a float bowl. It looks very much like this fellow here. And there's a level of fuel inside that bowl, and that level is critical. You absolutely have to have that spot on because it will impact the flow of fuel and the ability for the jets to operate correctly. So there's your float there, closes the needle and seat, so the fuel comes in to the bowl, into a needle and seat, and then is controlled by a float. That bowl is actually at atmospheric pressure too, so it's open to atmosphere. So you've got atmospheric pressure here, you've got atmospheric pressure there. Down the middle you have a slide, which is this guy, this cylinder, and that sits down in here. And on top of that is mounted a diaphragm, as you can see here. And that diaphragm is actually cactus. This one, it's got holes in it all the way around it. Some of them are quite large. And that means that the atmospheric pressure that's on this side of the diaphragm will equalise with whatever pressure's above it, so that's no good. I need to replace that. Below that is the needle jet. So the needle sits down in here like that, and there's a needle jet that comes up into the main venturi and sits just above the fuel level. And below that, screwed into the needle jet, is the main jet, and it has a fixed orifice or a hole drilled through the middle of it. At the engine side of the slide, there is another pathway up here to the top of the diaphragm, and that is under the lower pressure equal to the venturi. We'll just call it vacuum. So you have a low pressure here, an atmospheric pressure there, and as the velocity increases and the pressure reduces, the slide will lift in the chamber driven by this vacuum. It's actually aided by a spring to help close against the atmospheric pressure. So that is your needle and main jet. So as your throttle comes on, the needle lifts up, and as the needle suggests, it is actually a tapered, long thin taper. That's this guy here, the needle. And it lifts up out of this jet, and the further it lifts up, the more fuel it can get past this needle, and it shoots it out and atomises it into the airstream, and it draws all the fuel up through the main jet, but it's controlling the flow of the fuel, the needle jet does. This is only really any good from about just before half throttle and up to full throttle. At wide open throttle, this needle is lifted as high as it possibly can, and is open completely, and you're running purely, you're governed completely by the size of the hole in the main jet. Now, the way that carburetors cope with different engine demands is they actually have multiple circuits. We've just spoken about two, the needle jet and the main jet. But before they even come into play, there's another circuit called a primary circuit or a idle circuit. And so there's another jet that sits here. And that guy on these Mikuni carburetors actually has a pathway up around the outside of the venturi, and it comes in just past the throttle body. And the primary circuit, you can actually adjust, so you've got some control of that, sometimes called an idle or an air screw or multiple different names. But it is another needle jet, and it sits here. So it's got a screw. You can put a screwdriver in there, and you can wind that up and down and meter the amount of fuel that is coming in and on that side of the engine. So when the throttle is closed, this is the jet that is in play, and it has its own mini venturi, I suppose. It has its own atmospheric airflow that comes in from the front of the carburetor and joins into that circuit. So it has its own independent airflow. It has a controllable needle, and you can have some effect on that circuit. So that's your primary circuit or your idle circuit, and that's good for it. Actually plays a role in the fuel delivery right through the whole throttle range. However, it is at its most influential from zero throttle to about a bit after quarter throttle. And from that point on to about three-quarter throttle, your needle jet is your primary circuit. So it has the most influence on the carburetor. At three-quarter to full throttle, as I said earlier, you're running purely on the main jet. So pod filters, exhaust systems, why do we play with them? Well, if you increase the amount of air and fuel going into your cylinder, you're improving the volumetric efficiency of that cylinder, which is the theoretical amount of air and fuel you can actually cram into a cylinder that size versus reality. It's measured as a ratio percentage. So we increase the amount of air and fuel coming in, we're going to burn more, we're going to produce more power. And then at the other end of the engine, if we actually put a performance exhaust on there, we are going to improve the flow out of the engine. So what you've done is increase the velocity through and the volume of air that's coming through the cylinder just by fitting a pod, because they have a lot more airflow. And the reason they have a lot more airflow is because essentially engineers, the manufacturers, Yamaha, Suzuki, Ducati, doesn't matter who it is, they are operating to a budget, and they're also operating with a set of criteria. So they've got to produce a certain amount of horsepower, they've got to comply with emissions standards, they want to give you something that's got a good service life, that you're not going to come back and say my engine's worn out after 30,000 kilometres. So they give you a foolproof, bulletproof filter system that won't destroy your engine and still delivers adequate power. But we're building a cafe racer. We want to look cool, and pods are the go, let's face it. But the added advantage of pods is that they also improve the airflow. They've got a much greater surface area for the diameter, and they achieve that by folding the material like so and giving you greater surface area. One of the things you do have to watch with them, though, I don't know how good this is showing up on the video. I might just pop a bit of extra light in there and see if we can see. There's a shoulder in there. You've got to be careful that the pod filter you buy has a deep enough recess that it doesn't press that shoulder up against the end of your carburetor here. This is the atmospheric chamber for the vacuum, and you've got air for your pilot circuit, etc. going in there, and what you don't want to do is block all of that off, because your vacuum diaphragm won't work. You'll have trouble getting the primary circuit to work. That is a must. You have to make sure that you're not impacting it. So we've got our pod filter on. We've got our short exhaust on there. So what's going to happen is, like I said, we've got more air, but we've only got a limited amount of fuel because that hole won't let any more through. And the way you do that, what you have to do there is change your main jet. This is a packet of main jets, so just so you can have a look what they're like. I buy mine online from a company called Jets R Us, and what I'm going to do with this bike is just go for the rule of thumb to start with, and then I'll work up or down from there depending on requirements. So the rule of thumb is, and it really is just a rule of thumb, whatever main jet you've got in your bike, if you fit a pod filter, you should increase that main jet by 2.5. So if whatever jet it is, you need to go up 2.5 sizes. If you fit pod filter and an exhaust, then you want to change your main jet by 5 sizes, your pilot jet by 2.5, because you're going to be impacting that at this stage, and also lift the needle one position higher in the slide. So there's actually a clip down in there, you can shift the position of that needle up one, and that'll give you a starting point. Once you get it going, and probably the best place to start, in all honesty, is just with the standard jets. Make sure you've got a good clean carburetor and everything's running fine, and then you can have a play with it from there. But once you sort of get it running, what you want to do is start reading your spark plugs. Now, the best way to do that is to have the engine in neutral. If you've got an air-cooled thing, you might want to put a fan in front of it to keep the motor, give the motor some cooling. But you need to run the engine at the different throttle positions. So say 1/8, quarter, half, 3/4, full throttle. and at each stage you want to run for about 20 seconds. So 1/8 throttle, 20 seconds, flick the engine or kill button, pull the plug out, read it. Do that right through the whole range up to full throttle, and look at the variances. I'll put up some photos of what you need to be looking for. The first photo is of an engine that's running too lean. So that means that the fuel mixture to air ratio, there's not enough fuel. And what that does is it makes the engine run hot. And you might have heard about people leaning out their engine. Well, that's what you're looking at. And that means that because it relies on the fuel to help cool the combustion chamber. So what happens if you've got a lean engine? You can run too hot, melt pistons, burn out valves, etc. You want to avoid that at all costs. Engines tend to perform better when they're running leaner, particularly two-stroke engines, but it has adverse effects. At the other end of the scale is a rich spark plug. So that's one where there's too much fuel and a lot of carbon deposits, etc. Terribly inefficient. So a bit of flooding, that's not ideal. What you do want to be aiming for in the middle of all that is the ideal situation where you've got a nice sort of light chocolate brown, coffee brown coloured plug. Tells you that you're burning well. And that's probably the best way to gauge it at home when you're running. If you can do that and check your plugs, it's a fairly tedious exercise, but one worth doing. And then if you want to further refine that, you'd probably need to go find someone with a dyno, put it on there, and they can give you a better idea at what stage of your acceleration, your throttle opening, you're having any issues, and might be able to make suggestions as to which way to go. So yeah, that's the skinny on how to rejet your carburetor. Now the ones for my bike aren't quite ready to go yet. Might leave it a day or two, but I'll get them cleaned up, and when I go to fit the new jets and the new diaphragms and all the other bits and pieces, I'll make a video of that, and we'll get it set up. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching Basket Case. Subscribe and stay tuned, and we'll be back fairly shortly, getting ever closer to having a running bike, and I'll be pretty happy the day that we push the button and she fires up. All right, see ya. The important thing here is to get the gap correct between the swing arm and the frame. You've got to measure the distance between the two and try and get it